So coming on to Psalms of Lament, I see Psalms as, it is said, Psalms are words to God and words from God. In this unique interaction, we not only come to know who God is, but we also come to know who we are in relation to God. As you rightly mentioned, John Calvin says, Psalms are an anatomy of the human soul. There isn't any feeling that humans have had that is not expressed in one of the Psalms, moving from despair to total praise and joy. This suggests that all feelings are legitimate subjects as we interact with God in worship and in prayer. So this kind of interaction can be particularly seen in lament poems. A work of poetry, the Psalms of Lament are concerned primarily with experience. In this sense, they are depictions of psalmist disorientation caused by sufferings. And through these depictions and images, the psalmists convey their view of God, the life of faith, and the reality of life. Now, I have already mentioned, lament psalms a few times, but let me just quickly clarify what I mean by lament. Lament is a brutally honest complaint and confrontational expression of distress and pain before God. We can say it's a protest, but we need to be very careful using the word protest due to modern connotation of the word protest. This is not a political protest or social activism or even spiritual activism in order to get our demands fulfilled or met, but it is a protest before God which moves from despair to praise. The person who laments often draws attention to his or her distress, whether it is physical, spiritual, relational, or emotional, caused by danger from the enemy, oppression, injustice, alienation, exploitation, national tragedy, plague, loss, or death. Lament psalms then are complaints which insist, as Brueggemann says, four things: that things are not right in the present arrangements, they need not stay this way, and can be, and I would add, should be changed. The speaker will not accept them in this way for the present argument or arrangement, situation. In other words, they are intolerable or unsustainable. And fourthly, it is God's obligation to change things. So in this context of COVID-19 pandemic, the Psalms of Lament become particularly relevant globally in view of all kinds of losses sustained by communities, families, businesses, and individuals. More specifically, for us as minority in Pakistan and minority in various other countries, we regularly feel ourselves under pressure, face alienation due to estrangement from friends and family, experience oppression at times, injustice, exploitation, and are looked down upon either because of our faith, race, skin color, and even accent, both in our respective countries of birth or as diaspora, wherever we find ourselves. The Psalms of Lament provide a channel for us to express our distress, despair, and disappointment with God and before God. And therefore, we should be able to relate to Psalms of Lament and the experience of the psalmist portrayed in these Psalms. And we ought to, use lament Psalms more frequently in our worships. It is, however, lamentable that the lament psalms are largely either are disappearing or are disappeared both in our individual and corporate worship. The absence of lament in our church circles has huge implications: social, theological, spiritual, and pastoral. And we intend to tease out these implications or talk about these implications in our discussion today. Let me quickly highlight 5 implications or 4 implications or 4 points to highlight the importance of the Psalms of Lament. First, Psalms of Lament, present us as worshipers as a covenant partners. So the absence of lament leads to loss of intimate interaction or genuine interaction as covenant partners with God. This means if lament is absent, then no meaningful dialogue can take place between the covenant partners. The psalmist as a covenant partners can plead to God to fulfill his side of the covenant when the psalmist feels that God is not meeting his obligation effectively. And I think we as worshipers, as covenant partners, can do the same. Walter Brueggemann says, if, praise and doxologies are only allowed, then consciously or unconsciously, the voice of the petitioner in the covenant relationship is suppressed. God only becomes a head of a political party or a country, or I would say a dictator who, and we as Pakistan, people from Pakistan, we are very self-sufficient in terms of having dictators in the country or in political systems. These dictators only seek people who are, saying yes to their demands. If any protest is staged or voiced, that protest or voice is quickly suppressed or even eliminated. Secondly, the complainant becomes the initiator in the Psalms of Lament. The psalmist tries to persuade God to understand the urgency of the matter, and he seeks his intervention in order to change the circumstances. So the loss of lament then creates an unbiblical understanding of God being only the initiator and the one who is capable and willing to respond. According to Augustinian theology, it is only God who initiates. Whereas the Psalms of Lament say, no, we can initiate and God can be the respondent. And if only God is the respondent, it infuses fear and guilt and makes the believer accept guilt without protest. And when this kind of attitude is developed and is adopted, knowingly or unknowingly, in churches and society at large, that can lead to the kind of problems that we are facing now in Pakistan, both in society and churches. Additionally, if the offended party does not initiate a move for action and demands correction, it will encourage the offender to maintain the status quo without accountability. Thirdly, Psalms of Lament encourage us to demand justice. The psalmist pleads and urges God to uphold justice as a just judge. The laments raise voice against injustice perpetrated by the wicked, the enemy, or in some cases, God himself. Brueggemann goes on to say, a community of faith that negates laments soon concludes that the hard issues of justice are improper to be posed at the throne, because throne seems only to be a place of praise. I believe it thus follows that if justice questions are improper at the throne, they soon appear to be improper questions in public places, in schools and hospitals, with the government, and eventually in the courts. In this regard, in my observation, that the Asian diaspora tend to avoid confrontation. They do not protest as rapidly as sometimes they should because of this inbuilt attitude of silence in the face of offense caused by the offender. In short, lament psalms remind God his obligation to carry out justice, since human justice system is flawed and cannot be trusted. Lack of lament then suppresses an important voice against injustice. And lastly, if lament is omitted from our worships, this willful omission of laments from worship leads to denial, cover up, and detachment from reality. So our worship becomes hollow or merely a lip service. In other words, it encourages or unwittingly nurtures or fosters hypocrisy. It is quite the opposite of what the Christian worship intends to do. So in conclusion, Psalms of Lament demonstrate that it is permissible to express both positive and negative emotions in our interaction with God, quite contrary to a popular impression or practice among diaspora, by which only praise is legitimate response in Christian worship. Our worship should reflect what kind of God we worship and what kind of relationship we have with him. These are the implications. I have just touched or just scratched the surface. There is a lot more to talk about.
Well, thank you very much. This is such a fascinating and such an intriguing implications which we have right now. And as we talk about the scholarly approach and the classification of the orientation, disorientation, and reorientation of the Psalms of Lament, and as well as if we are only offering happy and clappy all the time and trying to show our strength and always in a mood which shows our gladness, I think that is a half picture and a distorted picture of a Christian worship. But as we carry on, and if we see these three orientation in not only in Pakistani context, but as well as diaspora, we see that I'm using three terms, which is in Urdu or Hindi we can use, which I see in the Psalms of Lament is dukh, dua, and dawa. And how that work in an English translation, I will call it anguish, application, and antidote. So these three terms we can coin in any context. And as well as now we are moving to the next step and the next perspective, which is more pastoral. And especially when we have seen that we need to come out from the shallowness of our worship. We have a wide range. We have miles and miles of range of instrumentalization, preaching and sermons and sacraments and everything, but an inch deep devotion and lament. And that's what we need to dig more to make it more meaningful. So I would request Reverend Isaac Inayat, all the way from Bahrain, in his pastoral experience in a multicultural context in the congregation and a multilingual, what you have seen the importance of Psalms in your ministry and context.
Thank you very much. As I am in Gulf, and Gulf is the home for millions of expatriates. People from their countries, they have come here to earn bread for their families and support their families. So millions of expatriates are living in this part of land, and their situation, their condition, and their needs, their emotional, psychological, and their spiritual needs, their physical situations, they are quite different from those people who are living in their own lands. For example, if I speak about the people among whom I'm ministering, they are not only from Pakistan, they are from different countries, but they are identical in their needs, in their situations. Here in Bahrain, nobody can work or live without a sponsor and who is a local national person. Because we all are bound to some local authority, local company, or a person who is called sponsor, so no one can go against that person. Even the travel documents are held by the sponsor or the companies where you are working. You cannot travel back to your countries without their will or wish. You are bound to live in that situation where you have put in the presence of God. From different faiths, from different cultures and languages, and you are bound to live in them. There are no facilities for people to express their emotions from what they are going through. They are bound to work like 12 hours a day without any complaint. They are not supposed to question their supervisor or their boss or their sponsor or the company head why you are using us for more than the hours which are entitled in the constitution or the law. They have no opportunity to complain. They are living in misery. They are living without their families. They are living without their friends and people with whom they can share this all. And in all this situation, when they have the physical problems, when they listen news from their families that they are going through the rough time, they are in need and they are helpless over here. They cannot reach out to them. And all this situation makes them frustrated. They can't express within their living spaces. They cannot express at their workplaces, but the only place where they can come and share is the church. Church has given them the platform that they can come with all their pressures, all their problems, all their situations, and here they can express it. Outside, they are not supposed to complain to anyone. For example, there are government institutions, departments where you can go and make a complaint against your oppressor. But if they make a complaint, people from those institutions, they will contact the person against whom the complaint is, and expatriate will be sent out. He will be fired from work and he will have to go to his country without having anything in hands. In all this situation, the only hope for people is to come to Lord's presence and hear if there is no lament psalm, how they will find appropriate that it is okay to complain. Outside, they have no opportunity to complain. But when they come in the presence of God in the form of lament psalms, they get something, the language in which they can make a complaint to God against the oppressors. It is not particularly the complaint against God that why you have put me in this situation. It can be in a sense, but mostly it is complaint against their oppressors, against the situation in which they are going through. And from my 10 years personal experience dealing with people from different cultures and countries, this is my experience that people have found much hope in the form of lament psalms. They found comfort in it, that we are not alone in the world who are going through such situations. There were many people before us who went through these situations. They were oppressed by the people. They were oppressed by their own relatives. They were oppressed by their own friends and their own community. But they found a place in the presence of God to express it all. And it is quite legitimate. It is not anti-religion. It is not anti-Christian. It is not the disbelieving in God, but it is the legitimate way to express our complaints against our oppressors. And they find it in the form of prayers, in the form of singing songs, and in the form of liturgy that is used in the congregation. They find solace, they find comfort, they find peace.
Well,
So
thank
this
you
is
very much, Reverend Isaac, especially sharing this story from this Gulf region. And as we see the history and the Judeo-Christian, especially since the arrival of the Jewish nation from the slavery of Egypt until the Babylonian captivity, And when they become landless, powerless, voiceless, how these psalms that have been generated and they have been produced their passion and their emotion. As we read the Psalm 137, and even when we read the Psalm 126, as well as when they were returning back and still voicing, even in the modern world, before World War II, we see the Sephardic and also the Ashkenazi Jewish, and how they kept their tradition of this landlessness and powerlessness under the strong regimes at persecuted, marginalized community. So when we talk about marginalized community and persecuted, voiceless, powerless Christians, obviously we recall our own country, our own land, Pakistan. And Pakistan has produced this Punjabi psalm and the voice extensively a century ago. We have Rev. Zeeshan Sadiq from Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church, and I would request Rev. Zeeshan to share his perspective and views on the use and the pastoral or the perspective on Psalms of Lament.
Thank you very much. I just want to pay tribute all of my fellow panelists, and especially for the initiative, Brother Eric, you have taken to engage us in this discussion. As far lamenting psalm is concerned, I was grown up in a typical Orthodox congregation. When I say Orthodox, I mean conservative Presbyterian congregation. I remember, if I'm right, in Sunday service, I mean the pastor we used to have in our congregations when I was growing, they didn't include hymns or other songs. Maybe just for at the time of offering collection, they used to have other hymns or songs. But I mean, the majority of worship included only psalms. And the same thing was, during the funeral times and during the memorial services time, and especially whenever our people used to face some sort of a calamity or a plague, and they used to prefer to include psalms. I don't say that our ARP church hold an exclusive psalmody position, because we believe that both psalms and hymns are important and they can be sung together. So there is no issue on this position. But I have been in pastor ministry for the last 14 years, but I have seen a big paradigm shift in this regard. I mean, there was a time when people were more inclined toward using psalms, but the trend has totally changed. Nowadays, people think it's not right to use psalms only. We should prefer to use hymns. And most of the services we have, majority of our worship include hymns, and we are ignoring psalms, including the lamenting psalm. The biggest problem I am confronting as a pastor for the last 14 years, I mean, when you have a funeral service, okay, you can sing Psalm 20, or you can sing Psalm 16 or Psalm 90, just to express your feeling, just to have some sort of a catharsis through these psalms. But when we have a second day, prayer service for the grieved family or bereaved family, the situation seems different. And the same thing happening at memorial service, people bringing musical instruments, and they think that we don't need to keep on expressing ourselves, expressing our deepest emotion, sorrow or the sadness or grief we are going through. They think that it is better. Now we just need to express our faith. We need to make ourselves or pretend ourselves that we have a faith in Jesus Christ. We have faith in resurrection. So we have to sing hymns that point us toward the resurrection of Jesus Christ or the day of resurrection. So, I feel as a pastor that we are ignoring the significance of these lamenting psalm in our congregation. And it's mainly because our theology is gradually changing. We are thinking that we need to write faith-based hymns that point us towards the final resurrection rather than uh, pointing toward the feelings we go through in our day-to-day life. Basically, the aspect Reverend Mahboob pointed out that we are denying the realities we are facing these days, and we are deliberately avoiding to express ourselves and pretending that we have firm faith and we don't need to sing these lamenting psalms. So trend is changing. We are totally, avoiding or deliberately ignoring these psalms in our congregation, whether in our individual capacity or whether we gather together for communal worship. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This is an intriguing conversation, and especially when we have four distinct contexts, and especially if I talk about American context right now, although I'm also living as a subculture, but because of my active participation in academia, we have seen there's a recently surge of the Psalms, and especially traditional churches and the liturgical churches, the liturgical renewal movement, and finding out the ancient practices from the early century. They are all pointing out and also the implementing and introducing academic disciplinary courses about worship and liturgical studies in the Western academics, which we are still lacking in our context. So we see that these movements and particularly, especially among pandemic around the world, we have seen peoples and the congregation and the cultures and societies, they are trying to finding out a platform and language to speak out their anguish and their uncertainty. And we know that especially in the Western context and the American context, when the American nation and American people, they feel that they are the leader of the world and they have to lead in all the way, they have to show their strength. But along with that, we are not filling the vacuum of human cry among the nations, and especially in our public places. So the question right now, which I'm asking you in your respective context, what are the practical implications and how a church or a leader or a pastor, whether they are in a mainstream culture or are living as a subculture in a diaspora, how can they raise and how can they teach and guide their congregation or communities to raise a voice as a counterintuitive or a countercultural against the tide of the strength and strong and the strongness of a nation? How can we show our humanness among all these this situation? So, Reverend Mahboob, over to you, and then our remaining panelists, you can pitch in to respond to this question.
Yeah, I would say there are different ways that we can explore or use. As a pastor, as a preaching elder, if you like, in congregation, I would start with me. It is my responsibility as a leader to highlight the importance of these lament psalms and preach them and encourage people. I do from pulpit, and I have even suggested multiple times that it is right to complain, it is right to protest, and even doubt at times, because doubt can lead to search, which can enhance and strengthen our faith. So there's nothing wrong. This is very countercultural, because in Christian context, it is discouraged. Doubt is discouraged. They say, don't doubt your faith. Just believe. And so that's one way. Prayer meetings can be organized and highlight the vulnerability of people, and it is right to feel vulnerable. I mean, Psalms of Lament can be, portrayed as identification with Jesus himself. He used Psalms, as you well know, the book of Psalms is called Jesus' prayer book. And so in the Passion narratives, you can see how Jesus used these lament Psalms, for instance, Psalm 22. And so we can highlight the importance of them, but also to say that when we use them, we identify with Jesus. So it's not the sign of a lack of faith, I would say, but it is actually sign of strong faith. Because when you complain, you go to a person who can make a difference. I give this analogy usually, that if you go to a manager, if you have a problem with bank staff, or you're finding difficulty in order to get your head around on your own finances, you go to the manager. You go to the manager because you think that he is the person who can make a difference in my situation. Similarly, Psalms of Lament encourage us to go back to the person who can make a difference. That is God himself. So in these ways, prayers, preachings, and personal discussions and public worships, we can preach these psalms or highlight the importance of it, which is quite counterculture, because our hymn books do not, I use mission praise. There are hardly any lament in that prayer book. And so we can, choose hymns that reflect lament time to time, and also our prayers in congregation can be, framed in such a way which will reflect the teachings of the Psalms of Lament.
Well, thank you very much for this practical implication. So, Reverend Isaac, while living in Bahrain, it's a Gulf and multilingual, multicultural, and even I'm unsure to say it's Islamic context. But however, how you see the use of Psalm, and how can you prompt to your congregation and the society?
Living in the multicultural and multilingual society in Bahrain, there is a difficulty, especially in singing psalms, because mostly we have the Punjabi version we use for singing. But people living here, and particularly their children, the young generation, they are not familiar with Punjabi. They find difficulty in speaking that, and how that very particular Punjabi language they can sing without having understanding. They find difficulty. So what way I found, I transliterated that into English, and then the third layer I put translation. So people from other languages, those who are not familiar with Punjabi or Urdu, so they can read transliterated form, and they can also understand the translation, that what is going to be sung. So we have found it very effective. And what I did personally in the congregation, weekly, we had a prayer session for 1 hour. And what I was doing, I was choosing a psalm, singing one verse, and then explaining it, and then praying according to that. So it made difference. So people get familiar with the Psalms and the beauty of Psalms, and they find it that it is the language that we can use in our prayers, and we can speak to God using this very language and words. So this is how we can use this: preaching, teaching, and being a model, and giving them example from ourselves. Let's lead the congregations. Let's lead the groups, our worship groups, our choirs, in understanding the song, the lament psalms. They can't sing it well if they don't understand it. So make the importance of the lament psalms alive in their minds and their hearts, and then make arrangements so they could learn. I hope you remember once I asked you, do you have the notation book of the Psalms? Because my singing team, they were getting serious in learning the Psalms, new Psalms. So then I started the search and we tried to find it. Still we are struggling, but how many we could find. So we are learning and we are using it in the service. So it is giving the language to praise and to prayer.
Well, thank you very much. So as we have seen that not only it's giving us a language, but also give us a vocabulary as well as a voice to share that multifaceted and multi-layer emotions in our public places and public worship. Reverend Zeeshan, how you see in Pakistani context, and especially in your faith tradition and ARP, to use these psalms in what ways you can imply that one?
One of the primary, tool I am using to encourage my people so that they can come back to start using Psalms again. I have been preaching on the book of Psalm for the last 2 years. And though we decided to have a break and started going through the letter to the Philippians, but I have been preaching at least for 2 years, going through the book of Psalms. So my intention was to preach from the book of Psalms so that they can get encouragement. They can become they can become familiar about the significance of Psalms. So this was my intention, to encourage people to go back to the Psalms through preaching. One of the other thing I think we can do while living in Pakistan, usually we don't sit with choir leaders. We usually think, and sometimes even the choir leader, they don't want to listen. They think that it's their responsibility. If pastor is independent to manage the worship order, they think that they should be independent to manage their worship, the rest of the worship order. But after serving for 13 years, I have realized, if you are the pastor, if you are the church leader, you should engage your session member, and you should directly communicate with your church, choir leaders, and you should tell them, if you are preaching on a particular psalm, for example, on Psalm 20 or Psalm 90 or Psalm 16 or Psalm 137. Usually these psalms are considered as Psalms of Lament. Why don't you include these psalms in your worship order, so people could not only listen to these psalms through preaching, they could also able to sing these psalms in their local language, or in their mother language. So first, I think preaching can be a way to encourage people so that they can come back using Psalms of Lament. Other way could be to engaging church choir leaders or encouraging them so that they could come back using these Psalms. I think third way or third means which needs to be used in these days, which I'm urgently feeling, we need to think about church discipline. Sometimes people react differently. They don't want to hear, they don't want to obey their church leaders. So they resist sometimes. If you won't allow us to do what we want to do, they often, argue. They say that we will leave your church, we will join any other church. I think pastors and church leaders, specifically in our Presbyterian circle, the session usually manages all of the affairs. If people are not submissive, the church order, then the people, such type of people should be disciplined. So this can be another way to, I mean, implementing these things we are discussing right now. So preaching and I mean, communicating with choir leaders and thinking about implementing church discipline if they don't, I mean.
Well, thank you very much. These are really very important issues to deal with that. So we have different proposals right now as well, because we have a preacher and teacher, and Reverend Mahboob and myself, I would consider also a no-voice musician as well. So still on the path to learning what music it is and bringing it and integrating into a public worship. So far, we have seen that although pastors, they try to preach, they try to teach, elders, preaching elders, and in our special Presbyterian system, but as well as in a prayer posture, prayer form. And when we talk about prayer, if we read the Jewish cycle of prayer, we know that tefillah prayer, evening, morning, and afternoon, the regular and the Sabbath prayer, and it's a whole prayer cycle. And sometimes we try to find out prayer mostly on a Sundays or on a regular personal or a family prayer. But having a liturgical order of prayer, that is another way, and especially using in these days lots of ways here, especially in the American context. I have read about pop psalms and how can we use and bring it in a popular culture. There are the rap psalms also. There are as well as a rock style psalms. And then we have a traditional conservative chant, hymnody, antiphonal. There are lots of myriad of ways to express psalms in a different way, depend on which cultural context you are dealing with that. Along with that, so we need to engage also, as our panelists have proposed, to bring and have a conversation with artists, with the musician and the choirs in the church. Sometimes pastors, as we talk about, pastors are untrained. They have not a formal training on a discipline of worship studies. That's another area we're lacking in our Pakistani context, and theological curricula. We need to focus on that. Along with that, I would like to pose now to our concluding point. So we talk about the strengthening discipline, spirituality, voicing the church. What is the role of Psalms in a mission? When we talk about our witness, our public witness, when we read Psalm 67, when we read Psalm 90, when we read Psalm 100, even Psalm 150, all this, the corpus of the book of Psalm, the primary purpose is to glorify God, to express his reign and show out as a showcase, our worship as a showcase to the nations, to bring it in to the praise of our God. So how you see in your own context the role of Psalms in interfaith, in conflict resolution, in peacemaking, and also as a missiological model to engage as a public witness outside the church walls? Over to you. Anybody can comment and start.
I would say, not necessarily, exact wordings of whether it's a metrical translation or exactly biblical, the translation words, but you can take a language or an idea or concept and express it in your own words, whether you frame prayers or you take part in, let's say, multi-religious meetings or context. I mean, most religions, almost all religions, if you say main three, religions, believe or accept Psalms as a divinely given a book, and therefore it is less likely that anybody would object to these psalms or poems which you can just read out as scriptures. I mean, in Pakistani context, I think Zeeshan can better comment on that, but I think some of the psalms that language is used in our Urdu and Punjabi translation refers to Israel and Jerusalem and all these things. And these words in Pakistani context can be controversial since Pakistan doesn't accept still Israel as a so there is a political kind of that's the difficulty. However, the fact that the Psalms have been used for decades. I mean, in my own research and book, I have mentioned, Psalms were used for mission. When the public singing of Psalms attracted other communities and eventually brought people to Christ. So public singing of the Psalms have a missional dimension to it, which should be, given much importance and given a serious attention to. And that's, I think, my thoughts, initial thoughts on it.
Well, thank you. Reverend Isaac.
Yes. From the missiological perspective, I will say that some religions, they portray God as master. And you will have to submit and pray and worship in a certain pattern that is set. You cannot add anything, and you cannot even express yourself. You are bound to say or repeat a set of prayers or words. But when we use Psalms in the Christian worship, it reflects that we worship such God who is open to all human emotions. He is not stopping anyone from expressing him or herself. So it gives a room for others to see our God and our faith as very much expressive, very much closer to human heart. And it can be a help, as Reverend Mahboob has mentioned, that the singing the Psalms in public arena, it attracts people. It gives the feel, oh, this is my feeling. This is what I feel. Oh, this is a beautiful thing to say to God. And I remember one politician from Pakistan in his election campaign, he read out Psalm 91 in his public rally. And he said that somebody has sent me this morning this beautiful prayer from the book of Psalms, which he acknowledged that we also believe as a Muslim. And he read it out in his political rally, and it is on the social media as well. So this is the beauty, that if we present Psalms as our prayer and as our part of worship or worship liturgy or worship language, so it attracts people and they feel that this faith is having freedom to express ourselves.
Wonderful. Reverend Zeeshan, what do you state about in your own context?
As far missional significance is concerned, I would go back to Sir Mahboob's point regarding its regarding as covenanter initiative, because I think when you are in a covenant relationship, Bible explicitly talk about covenants more than 284 times. You see the description of a covenant relationship. Whenever you are in covenant, both parties have certain responsibilities, and both parties enjoy different privileges. So I think these lamenting psalm can be used as a mission to tell other nations that the God of the Bible, or a Christian God, he gives us privilege to strengthen our relationship as a covenant partner. And being covenant partner, we have the privilege to make certain complaints that we are facing injustice in our lives. And this is explicitly seen in the book of Job, when he was suffering, going through all of the sufferings. And as we go through in the subsequent chapters of the book of Job, basically he is expressing his lament, his grief, his inner emotions, that he is facing, injustice. Basically, I think the point Reverend Mahboob made, this can be used to let other nation know that we Christian people, or the people of the Bible, or the God of the Bible, allows people to make a covenant relationship with Him, and when their rights are sabotaged or compromised, God allows them that they can make complaints. And I'm in the presence of lamenting psalm in the book of in the Bible. It explicitly show that we can express ourselves, because as it's a famous proverbs, it is better to blow off than to suffer in silence. So these psalms can be helpful, letting other nation know that God of the Bible allows you to make a covenant relationship with Him, and when the rights of the people are compromised, they can make complaint in front of Him through
Well,
these
thank you very
lament.
much. Thank you very much. These are really, really insightful and fascinating thoughts. And especially as from taking the point of departure for our today's conversation, we have just scratched the surface through this program. And we are planning to bring more voices from our context, as those people who are watching carefully our activities and our program events in Pakistan as well. A few years ago, we have already organized a Mission of Hermeneutic conference with the partnership of Gujranwala Theological Seminary as well as Christian Studies Center in Rawalpindi. And we are planning to continue this one as we are engaging with a different context, and especially in a global context. We four panelists, although we all belong to a same context, which is the Pakistan Muslim, predominantly 97% Muslim context, and especially serving in a different capacity. These voices and engagement with the contextual theology, that's very important. And especially when we are taking a departure as a covenant. So Jesus Christ, when he rose from dead, according to Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 44, Jesus Christ summarized and he concluded, and when he commissioned to his disciples, he said, everything written in the book of law, the Moses, the prophet, and the book of Psalms concerning Christ, concerning the suffering, concerning the mission of the church, has been handed over to the disciples, and the church has this mandate now from creation to new creation. We are part of this ongoing process, and Psalms of Lament plays a great role. Not only Psalms of Lament, there are more than a dozen categories in the book of Psalm which we find, and we can voice them through as our human voice and vocabulary. So, but the need is there that the churches, congregation, communities, public place, in a private family, or in as a witness, we need to bring this voice out and invite other people and other nations, ethnies, to include their voice, their stanzas in the ongoing melody of God's mission in our generation. So I would like to thank our panelist, Reverend Mahboob from Scotland, Reverend Isaac Inayat from Bahrain, and Reverend Zeeshan Sadiq from Pakistan, and myself from Southern California. And we would like to encourage you, keep watching. We are bringing more programs. We are bringing more conversation. We are bringing more voices to add and to share our contribution in the global perspective, in a global arena, to bring our contextual voices. Reverend Mahboob, Reverend Zeeshan, do you have any final thought, any final comment? Please do so.
Can I just say one thing? In terms of poetry, Psalms are essentially poetry. You know, they are poetry. As I sometimes attempt to write poetry, I think poets' basic intention is to invite people to share his experience, you know, through his words or her words. They invite people to not only simply be readers, but actually experience the emotions that the writer goes through. So in this way, Psalms are really a kind of a big house, which, you know, in which the writer invites you to experience that and then express these feelings out there to witness, their faith from lament to praise. Remember, the target is from lament to praise, not to live in lament like other nations, but to move from lament to praise, because that will glorify God. For that to happen, you first have to go from orientation first, then to disorientation, and then to reorientation. And that's the path that we have to take. And remember that that is the way to glory.
I would just add that as a church leader, we should encourage our people that don't suppress your inner feelings. We have the beautiful contents in form of lamenting psalm. So express yourself, and when you will express yourself, you will feel comfortable. Otherwise, you will keep suffering from other issues, health challenges. So when, the Old Testament believer, they had some sort of an issue in their lives. They they expressed themselves through lamenting psalm. So we should also follow their lifestyle, their way. And this is how we can put our request in front of God.
Reverend Isaac?
Yes, I'll give the final comment that Jesus has given the example, like in his times of sufferings, he used the psalm. He questioned God. And it is quite okay to ask God questions. We don't mind that. We shall use it. We shall use this pattern of talking to God and asking. And thank you, Reverend Mahboob, for pointing it out that all lament is not to live in lament always, but its result is to praise God. Because when we lament, when we complain to God for our situations, he delivers us. And this is the pattern that Bible gives us, that he will not let us to live permanently in misery or trouble and a state of oppression. He will deliver us as he has delivered whole humanity through his son, Jesus Christ, and has given us the songs of praise.
Well, thank you very much. So we have seen that, first of all, if you really want to be authentic and honest with your worship, lament, cry out, complain. Psalms provide us vocabulary and voice to put our complaint into our prayer box and pour out to God's throne room with the heart which is open to God. Like John Calvin said, I offer thee my heart promptly and sincerely. So beside that, as Reverend Mahboob mentioned, this is a transition. This is not only a beginning and the end like other nations. God has given us opportunity. We can cry in our grief, we can compel in our belief, and then we can plead with our faith. So this is what we need to do. Psalms, Book of Lament, provide us this opportunity to offer our honest and authentic praise to God's throne room. So this conversation is open-ended. We are not saying we are expert, we are experimenting, we are exploring, we are learning. So please send us your comments and your critique, not only just for critique, because before our brown guys. So before our learning with you all, it's a pilgrimage through the book of Psalm, which we are all walking with all of you. So send us comments if there you find any gaps, and if you would like us to have our voice on certain topics. Send us your suggestions. We are very open, and we are planning to continue these kind of conversations. So God bless you all. Sing psalms, be authentic and honest to God's throne room. God bless you all. Thank you very much, Reverend, and all your conversation and all your insights. God bless you.
Thank you very much. Blessings to you too.